There is a sound that comes before the end of civilization. It is not the polished thunder of space marine drop pods, or the cold whisper of a tyrannid hive mind reaching out across the void. It is not the grinding hymn of Necron legions rising from their tomb worlds after 60 million years of dreamless sleep. No, the sound that truly signals the end of a world is far older than all of that. It is a roar. A living, breathing, laughing, bellowing wall of noise that rises from a million green throats at once, swelling outward like a tide, like a storm, like something that was never designed to stop. It is the voice of the Orks. And if you can hear it, you are already too close. Section 1. The Green Tide, Warhammer 40,000 is a setting built on nightmares. Every faction that occupies its grimdark galaxy is terrifying in its own particular way. The forces of chaos are horror distilled into theology. The Tyrannids are an extinction event wearing the skin of living creatures. The Necrons are mathematical inevitability given cold metal form. The Aeldari are the long shadow of a civilization that burned itself down and has been dying in slow motion ever since. But the Orks, those howling, laughing, endlessly multiplying green-skinned warlords of the stars, occupy a category of terror that is somehow different from all the rest. Because while the other great dangers of the galaxy might one day be reasoned with, contained, or at least understood, the Orks cannot be. Not really. Not in any permanent way. Think about what it actually means to face an Ork invasion. Other threats can be managed through strategy, through sacrifice, through desperate holding actions that buy time for reinforcement. An Eldar war host can be driven back to its craft world. A Chaos warband can be scattered across the warp if the right rituals are performed. Even the Tyrannids, despite being perhaps the most existentially terrifying presence in the galaxy, operate according to biological logic that can, theoretically, be exploited. If you destroy the synapse creatures, the swarm fragments. If you deny biomass, the fleet moves on. These are threads you can pull. But Orks? Orks do not retreat because retreat does not make sense to them. They do not abandon a campaign because they are running low on supplies, because they do not need supplies the way other armies do. They do not lose their faith when their leaders die, but because another leader always rises to take the place of the fallen, and that leader is almost always more dangerous than the one before. And most horrifying of all, if you defeat an Ork invasion and drive every last green skin from your world, you have not won. You have started a countdown, because every Ork that ever set foot on that ground, every Ork that ever bled and died in those fields, left something behind. Microscopic, patient, waiting. And decades later, or centuries later, long after the celebrations and the memorials and the rebuilding, new green-skin shapes will begin to emerge from the darkness at the edges of your settlements, and the whole terrible cycle begins again. That is the Ork in its essence, not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured, not an enemy that can be truly defeated, in only temporarily redirected. The Imperium does not classify Ork infestations as military threats in its internal documentation. It classifies them as diseases. The distinction is not rhetorical. Diseases do not surrender. Diseases do not run out of reinforcements. Diseases do not get tired. And diseases, once established in an environment, persist with a stubbornness that outlasts everything the infected body tries to throw at them. There is a quote attributed to an unnamed imperial scholar, passed down through centuries of academic literature within the Ordo Xenos, that reads simply, "An Ork invasion is not an event. It is a diagnosis." And that single, quietly devastating line captures something true about the Greenskins that all the battle reports and tactical assessments in the Imperium's archives somehow fail to convey. When Orks come, they do not just fight you, they change you. They change your world. They leave a mark that no amount of reconsecration or rebuilding can entirely erase. And yet, even knowing all of this, even sitting with the full weight of what an Ork invasion truly represents, there is something else that the Orks carry with them that no other faction quite manages to replicate. Something strange. Something that, if you let yourself sit with it long enough, starts to feel almost like wonder. The Orks love what they do. Genuinely, completely, with every cell of their fungal animal hybrid bodies and every spark of their psychic gestalt consciousness, the Orks love war. Not in the tortured, complicated way that a soldier might learn to love battle after years of conditioning. not in the dark, ecstatic way that the followers of chaos embrace violence as devotion to their gods. The orcs love war the way a river loves flowing, the way fire loves wood. It is not a choice they made. It is not a philosophy they adopted. It is simply what they are, written into their biology, encoded in their genetics 60 million years ago by creators who needed the perfect warrior and who may have succeeded beyond anything they imagined. Consider the implications of this for a moment. Human military doctrine spends enormous resources managing morale, because soldiers who stop believing in the cause will stop fighting. Entire strategic disciplines exist around breaking an enemy force by breaking its will before you break its physical capacity. This works. It is one of the most reliable tools in the military philosopher's toolkit. Yet none of it works on orcs. You cannot make an orc stop believing in the cause, because the cause is fighting, and an orc in a battle is already doing the cause. You cannot undermine its faith, because its faith is the direct experience of what it was made for, happening right now, all around it. You cannot create doubt, because doubt requires the ability to imagine a universe in which things would be better if you did not fight, and that universe is simply not comprehensible to the orc mind. It is a category error, like asking water to consider the possibility that it might not want to be wet. This is the story of those warriors. Where they come from, what they are made of, how they think, how they fight, and why every other species in the galaxy should be afraid of what the orcs represent. Not just as a military threat, as an idea, says as a principle, as a force that has existed since before humanity evolved, and that shows no signs of stopping. If you enjoy this kind of deep lore content and want to see more, please subscribe and drop a comment below. Tell me your favorite orc clan. Tell me what other factions you want explored. Tell me what surprised you from what you have heard so far. The community here shapes what gets made next. Now, let us go all the way back to the very beginning, when the galaxy was young and its first great war was being fought, and something green and impossible and terrifyingly alive was being born. Section 2, Born of Ancient War. The Krork and the Old Ones, 60 million years before the Imperium of Man drew its first breath, before humanity had learned to walk upright on the plains of ancient Terra. But the galaxy was already ancient beyond imagining. It was a place of empires and catastrophe, of gods and machines, of civilizations that had risen and burned and left their bones scattered across the stars. And at the center of all of it, at the absolute heart of everything that would one day become Warhammer 40,000, was a war. Not a war like the ones humanity would fight in its long and bloody history. Not a war over territory, or resources, or ideology. A war over the fundamental nature of reality itself, fought across the entire span of the galaxy by beings whose power makes everything in the 41st millennium look modest. A war so vast that its aftershocks are still being felt tens of millions of years later, shaping every conflict and every catastrophe that has unfolded since. The Aeldari remember it as the war in heaven. So the Necrons experienced it as their founding trauma and their greatest shame. And the Orks, in their own oblique and characteristically chaotic way, were born directly from its most desperate moments. To understand the Orks, you have to understand the Old Ones first. The Old Ones were perhaps the most ancient sapient species the galaxy ever produced, a civilization so advanced that they had mastered the structure of reality itself at a level that most modern species can barely conceptualize. They bent the laws of physics to their will. They traveled between star systems through the webway, a network of tunnels through dimensional space that bypassed the warp entirely, making interstellar travel safe and swift in a way that the warp-dependent methods of later civilizations never managed. Yet they spread life across the stars with the casual authority of gardeners tending a greenhouse, seeding worlds, uplifting species, engineering the conditions for intelligence to emerge in dozens of different forms across the galaxy. If a civilization exists in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, the Old Ones almost certainly had a hand in making it possible. But the Old Ones had enemies. The Necrontyra were a civilization of humanoid beings who lived beneath a punishing and radiation-heavy sun, their lives short and agonizing, their bodies breaking down from stellar radiation, even as their minds burned with ambition and deep corrosive resentment. They had achieved a degree of interstellar expansion, spreading to neighboring systems through slow sublight travel, but the fundamental tragedy of their existence followed them everywhere they went. When they encountered the Old Ones, who seemed to possess the secret of effective immortality, the Necrontyre felt a jealousy that curdled into something much darker, and eventually that darkness became open war. The Necrontyre could not match the Old Ones in psychic power or in technological sophistication, so they looked elsewhere for power, and they found it in the most terrifying form imaginable: the C'tan, the star gods. Ancient beings of living energy, intelligences that had drifted between the stars since the universe's first ages, feeding on the radiation of suns, barely conscious, barely present. The Necrontyre discovered them. They designed bodies of living metal for them, necrodermis, which focused the C'tan's diffuse energies into physical forms capable of acting with directed purpose. The C'tan, yet given form and hunger and direction, became the most powerful physical entities the galaxy had ever seen. In exchange for the gift of metal bodies, the C'tan offered the Necrontyre what they had always craved: immortality. They transferred Necrontyre consciousness into metal shells, their biological bodies consumed in the process, their souls drained to feed the star gods during the Great Biotransference. What emerged were the Necrons, immortal, metal, absolutely loyal to their new masters, and utterly stripped of everything that had once made them a people. They had their immortality. They had lost everything that made immortality worth having. Together, C'tan and Necrons drove the Old Ones back across the galaxy. The C'tan were beyond psychic assault, immaterial entities of enormous power, immune to the warp-based attacks that were the Old Ones' primary weapons. Entire systems fell. Ancient webway nodes were destroyed. Civilizations that the Old Ones had cultivated for millions of years were consumed. The Old Ones found themselves in a war they could not win with the tools they had always relied on. So, they built new tools. The Old Ones responded with a strategy that reflects both their genius and a certain desperate urgency. They began engineering new species, each designed to fill a specific role in the escalating war. The C'tan were psychically inert, so the Old Ones created species with great individual psychic talent, beings who could channel the power of the immaterium in ways that affected even material entities. The Aeldari were the crown of this project, a species of extraordinary individual psychic sensitivity given a natural lifespan long enough to develop that potential fully. But the Aeldari were individuals. They thought for themselves. They had agendas and emotions and the capacity to decline. They were allies, not weapons. What the Old Ones also needed, urgently and absolutely, were soldiers. Not thinking allies, not strategic partners. Pure, absolute, relentless soldiers who would never question, never hesitate, and never stop. Warriors who would charge into the cannon fire of immortal metal constructs without concern for survival. Who would absorb catastrophic casualties and keep moving forward because moving forward was simply what they were built to do. Beings who would fight at any scale, in any environment, against any opposition, without requiring strategic guidance or emotional management. And so the Old Ones created the Krork. The Krork were, by every account that survives in the fragmentary records of the Aeldari and the Necrons, extraordinary beings. Aeldari texts describe creatures of immense size and ferocity, beings that seemed to grow larger and more powerful the longer the fighting continued. Some accounts describe individual Krork reaching heights of up to 12 meters, the size of a large building, not a vehicle, but a single living creature standing 12 meters tall and designed to fight. The Necron Lord Oltix, in texts preserved from that ancient period, stated that the Orks had been designed specifically as a counter to Necron supremacy, which tells you how seriously the Necrons took them as opponents. The Krork were also deeply intelligent. Unlike the modern Orks, who carry instinctive technical knowledge but limited capacity for higher-order reasoning, the Krork apparently possessed genuine strategic sophistication alongside their physical might. Aeldari accounts note that Krork commanders could direct complex multi-front operations with a tactical fluency that matched the Aeldari generals who fought alongside them. They had technology that exceeded what the Adeptus Mechanicus has produced in 10,000 years of careful preservation and development. This is not a comfortable claim, but the evidence for it sits in the ancient records without contradiction. All of this, the size, the intelligence, the technology, was written into the Krork genome by Old One engineering of breathtaking sophistication. The knowledge did not need to be taught. It did not need institutions to preserve it or teachers to transmit it. It was in the blood, activated by appropriate conditions, available to any Krork who reached the developmental triggers that unlocked it. A civilization that could survive the death of all its teachers, because the teachers were the genome itself. And then the war in heaven ended. Not cleanly, not with a clear winner standing over the defeated. The Necrons, exhausted beyond endurance and facing the growing power of the psychic species the Old Ones had created, eventually turned on their own Satan masters. The Silent King ordered the great rebellion that shattered the star gods into fragments, denying them their victory at the cost of everything the Necron civilization had become. The Necrons then entered stasis, 60 million years of sleep, waiting for the galaxy to recover. The Old Ones, whose own desperate psychic engineering had inadvertently destabilized the warp and created the conditions for the enslaver plague that followed, could not hold against the new threats pouring through the gaps in reality. They faded. They dispersed. They were gone. The Krork were left without purpose, without an enemy to fight, without the Old Ones to direct them, without the war in heaven to sustain the levels of violence that fueled their growth. The Krork fragmented and turned on each other. They fought among themselves the way that things designed purely for combat will always fight when there is no external enemy. And over the course of millions of years, without the pressure that had favored enormous and sophisticated beings, they diminished. As the ancient knowledge in their genes faded as generations passed, without the stimulation to unlock it fully, the great size gave way to something smaller. The sophisticated technology gave way to instinct. The vast intelligence that had fought Necron phalanxes on equal terms gave way to something more immediate, more reactive, more useful in the context of a species now primarily fighting itself. They became the Orks. Every Ork that has ever terrorized the galaxy carries in its genes the ghost of something designed to fight gods. They are diminished descendants of beings created by the greatest civilization in galactic history to do one specific thing: win. At any cost, against any opponent, in any numbers, forever. The Ork is not a savage. The Ork is a weapon that has been running without direction for 60 million years, and which may, but under the right conditions, be capable of becoming what it originally was. That last part is the part that should keep you awake at night. Section 3. The biology of violence. Fungus, flesh, and spores. Imagine the ideal warrior, not an ideal soldier in the human sense, with body armor and training and supply chains. Imagine something more fundamental, a living thing designed from the ground up, at the cellular level, to be the perfect engine of combat. Something that can fight without food, recover from wounds that would kill anything else, replace its own dead without external intervention, and never, under any circumstances, stop. That thing is an Ork. And the reason an Ork can be all those things is because an Ork is not entirely what it appears to be. To a casual observer, an Ork looks like a large, green, extremely muscular humanoid with tusks, a jutting jaw, and a posture that communicates maximum aggression. This impression, while accurate on the surface, misses the most important thing about an Ork's biology. At its most fundamental level, an Ork is a fusion of animal and fungal biology, two life systems that have merged so completely after millions of years that they cannot be meaningfully separated. The animal side provides the musculature, the brain, the nervous system, the pack-based social instincts. The fungal side does everything else, and the everything else is genuinely extraordinary. An Ork's distinctive green color is not animal pigmentation. It is the visual signature of algae that permeates the Ork's cellular structure at a deep level, running through skin and blood like a living dye. This algae performs photosynthesis. An Ork standing in natural starlight is actively extracting energy from that light and adding it to its metabolic reserves. Imperial Magos biologists who have studied this phenomenon estimate that an Ork in good sunlight can derive a significant portion of its daily energy requirements from photosynthesis alone. This is a military advantage of the most profound kind. An army that partially feeds itself from ambient light does not need the supply chains that make other armies vulnerable to interdiction. You cannot starve an Ork warband. You can reduce it, inconvenience it, make it grumpy. You cannot stop it by cutting its logistics the way you might cripple a human force. The internal architecture of an Ork reflects the same philosophy of distributed resilience. Where human bodies rely on discrete organs that can be individually targeted and destroyed, The orc's body cavity is filled with what Magos biologists have described as a fungal medium, a dense living biological substrate that performs the biochemical work of a liver, spleen, pancreas, and kidneys simultaneously, distributed throughout the body cavity rather than concentrated in any single location. You cannot kill an orc by targeting its liver, because the orc does not have a liver in any meaningful sense. The function is everywhere, distributed, redundant. You would have to destroy the entire body cavity at once to meaningfully impair the system, and by the time you have managed that, you have defeated an orc through other means entirely. The bones of an orc follow the same principle: thick, dense, that reinforced far beyond what normal movement requires. Their core filled with spongy fungal matter rather than marrow, they flex under impacts that would shatter a human skeleton entirely. Orc bones absorb forces that should be catastrophic. They distribute kinetic energy through the fungal structure in ways that prevent the fractures and cracks that would disable a less robustly constructed skeleton. An orc can be hit by something that would break every bone in a human body and keep walking, not because it does not register the impact, but because the impact, as far as its skeletal structure is concerned, was within operational parameters. The cardiovascular system features two hearts working in concert, each capable of sustaining the orc independently if the other is damaged or destroyed. Green, such iron-rich orc blood clots with extraordinary speed, the fungal components of the circulatory system rushing to seal wounds almost before the orc has registered the injury. An orc can lose limbs, ears, eye sockets, and quantities of blood that would kill a human many times over and remain combat capable because the biological systems designed to manage precisely this kind of ongoing damage are still functioning and have been since the orc was born. The healing capacity deserves extended attention. The fungal organisms in an orc's blood are constantly active, monitoring the orc's physical state and responding to damage almost immediately. When an orc is wounded, these organisms begin repair before the orc has fully registered the injury. Tissue is knit back together. Said blood loss is arrested by the same fungal processes that keep the wound site metabolically active even as it seals. The orc's regenerative capacity is not as spectacular or rapid as a tyrannid bioform's regeneration, but it is relentless, consistent. It does not stop. It does not get tired. It just keeps working on the damage as it occurs. The famous case of the orc head deserves mention because it is not a myth. Under certain conditions, an orc's head can survive independently of its body for a meaningful period after decapitation. The brain continues to function, drawing on fungal reserves in the thick skull structure. This is what makes the orc painboy's practice of head transplants something other than an absurdist joke. Yet the orc's biology actually treats decapitation as a form of severe trauma to be managed rather than a condition incompatible with life. The head can be reattached, the body adapts. The orc wakes up, possibly somewhat confused about which direction its legs face, and goes back to fighting. The size of an orc is not fixed at birth or at maturity. It continues throughout the orc's entire life, driven by a combination of combat experience, accumulated fighting success, and the psychic regard of peers. An orc boy of roughly human size will, through a long career of successful fighting, grow into a knob. A successful knob grows into something approaching 2.5 meters of hostile, armored, scarred muscle. A warboss who has led successful campaigns across years and across worlds can reach 3 meters in height, and in rare cases considerably more. The very largest warbosses, the ones who have gathered enormous crusades behind them and have been bathed in the full intensity of the gestalt field at high concentration for extended periods, can exceed 4 meters. At these sizes, the ancient Krork heritage is beginning to reassert itself, not metaphorically but literally, as the genetic potential encoded 60 million years ago is unlocked by the conditions it was designed to respond to. This means that killing an orc warboss does not solve the problem it represents. The conditions that grew that warboss into what it is are still present. The crusade that generated those conditions is still intact, still generating the psychic field, still breeding the combat pressure that unlocks the ancient potential in orc genes. Yes, the next warboss that rises will face those same conditions, and it will grow, possibly faster, because the crusade has already achieved the scale that drives the growth mechanism, and the new warboss inherits all of that momentum. Now, consider what happens when all of this extraordinary resilience combines with the orc method of reproduction. And you begin to understand why the phrase cleansing an orc-infested world describes a theoretical exercise rather than a practical outcome. Orcs do not reproduce sexually. They do not need a partner, a breeding population, or even to be alive when they reproduce. Orcs release spores throughout their entire lives, microscopic biological packets containing the full genetic and developmental blueprint for new orcoid life. They release these spores passively and constantly, each from skin and breath and blood, and they release them most abundantly at the moment of death. An orc dying on a battlefield is simultaneously a casualty and a seed. These spores settle into the ground, where they can remain dormant for years or decades, waiting for the right conditions to germinate: light, moisture, warmth, the presence of soil chemistry. The fungal components of the spore recognize as viable. When conditions arrive, the spores do not simply grow into new orcs. They grow into an entire ecosystem. Squigs emerge first from the germinating spore beds, then snotlings, then Gretchen, and finally the orcs themselves, already knowing how to fight, already speaking their language, already angry about everything, and ready to do something about it. No parent, no teaching, no infrastructure. On just the genome doing what it was designed to do, recreating a full orcoid civilization from a handful of microscopic spores in alien soil. Planetary ecologists attached to imperial forces have documented cases where worlds cleared of orc infestation through massive orbital bombardment, surface defoliation with industrial-grade toxins, and follow-up ground operations lasting years subsequently produced new orc populations emerging from deep soil beds that survived all of the above. The spores can go deep, deeper than most decontamination protocols are designed to address. They can survive temperature extremes, chemical environments, radiation levels that would kill most other biological material. They are patient in the way that rocks are patient. They are simply waiting. This is why the Imperium classifies orc infestations alongside diseases rather than military occupations in many internal documents. Diseases do not need supply lines. Diseases do not lose battles in any permanent sense. And diseases, once established in an environment, have a deeply frustrating tendency to persist, no matter how thoroughly you think you have treated them. The orc is a weapon system, not a soldier. A weapon system that includes its own logistics, its own replacement parts, its own manufacturing process, all contained within the biology of every individual orc that has ever lived. The old ones built something that would keep running without them, and it has, for 60 million years, with no signs of slowing. At Section 4, the orc mind and the gestalt field. Psychic belief made reality. There is an old imperial joke that goes, an orc's greatest weapon is its unshakable confidence that everything it does will work. The punchline is that this is not actually a joke. It is one of the most deeply unsettling truths in the entire setting. The orc's confidence is not bravado. It is not the performative certainty of a creature trying to convince itself. It is the living expression of a psychic phenomenon that can, under the right circumstances, bend physical reality to match the orc's expectations. Every single orc, from the smallest snotling to the largest war boss, generates a small amount of psychic energy. Not enough to make any individual orc a psyker in any meaningful sense, but the orc race numbers in the hundreds of billions, yet possibly into the trillions across all the scattered greenskin populations of the galaxy. When you add together the psychic contribution of hundreds of billions of beings who all share essentially the same simplified, unified psychological state, the overwhelming desire to fight and win, you get something extraordinary. You get the gestalt field. The gestalt field is one of the most powerful collective psychic phenomena in the galaxy. Unlike the individual talents of a human or Ieldari psyker, it is ambient, atmospheric, a background radiation of green psychic energy that permeates any space where orcs are present in significant numbers. And this field has a property that, once understood, reframes everything about the orcs in a deeply alarming way. The gestalt field makes orc beliefs real, not metaphorically. When enough orcs believe something strongly enough, that belief can translate into a change in physical reality through the medium of their collective psychic energy. The canonical example, studied extensively by Ordo Xenos researchers who struggled to publish their findings without causing widespread institutional panic, is the color red. Orks believe, with the simple unquestioning faith of beings who have never experienced doubt, that red things go faster. Red vehicles, red armor, red guns, and the gestalt field channeling this collective belief actually makes it so. Imperial tech priests who have examined this phenomenon in controlled conditions have confirmed it. Ork vehicles painted red do measurably outperform identical vehicles painted other colors. The belief creates the effect. This extends across all Ork cultural consensus. Must yellow explosives create bigger explosions because Orks believe yellow means destruction. Guns held by Orks who believe wholeheartedly in their weapon's power perform beyond what the physical components justify. The same weapon, removed from Ork hands and tested in an Imperial laboratory, often fails to function properly at all because the psychic investment that was making it work is no longer present. Adeptus Mechanicus researchers who have reverse-engineered Ork technology describe an experience that one Magos characterized as examining a design that should not work, and finding that the reason it did work is somewhere in the philosophy rather than the engineering. The Ork gestalt field is distinct from warp-based psychic powers in an important way. It does not interface with the immaterium the way human or Aeldari psyker powers do. And Ork Weird Boys, who serve as the formal psykers of Greenskin society, draw their power from the ambient gestalt energy generated by surrounding Orks, rather than directly from the warp. This means the field does not attract demons the way a human psyker's connection might. It does not create the spiritual vulnerabilities that chaos requires to establish a foothold. It is a self-contained biological phenomenon, a legacy of Old One design that gave the Krork psychic capability without the vulnerabilities that come with direct warp connection. The Old Ones, designing a soldier that needed to operate in the most dangerous environments imaginable, made sure their weapon was not itself vulnerable to the forces it was fighting in. The field scales with numbers and intensity. A warband of a few thousand produces a low-level field, and enough to make the worst of their technology work reliably and to slightly amplify individual combat capability. A warband of tens of thousands starts to do genuinely strange things to local physics. Vehicles that should fall apart hold together through pure collective belief. Weapons that have no right to fire keep firing, and wounds that should be crippling heal faster than biology alone can explain. A crusade of millions creates a psychic presence so potent that it begins to alter the local warp, not opening it to demonic incursion, but simply reinforcing the membrane of the material world with green determination. The universe, in a territory saturated by a large enough Ork crusade, is a slightly more Orky place than it otherwise would be. And things being Orky means things working the way Orks expect them to work. It's the growth mechanism ties directly into this. Individual Orks never stop growing throughout their lives, but the rate of that growth is partly dependent on the intensity of the surrounding gestalt field. An Ork in a small warband grows relatively slowly, its development limited by the modest field generated by modest numbers. An Ork in a massive crusade, bathed continuously in a field of extraordinary power, grows faster, gets bigger, gets stronger, becomes more like what the Krork were at their height. The scale of the crusade directly determines the biological potential of its members, which means that the right leader, gathering followers at the right rate, sustaining a campaign at the right intensity, is not just building an army, and they are actively catalyzing the transformation of that army into something that has not walked the galaxy in 60 million years. Weird Boys are the cutting edge of what the gestalt field can do when channeled through a single individual. They absorb ambient psychic energy from surrounding mobs and discharge it in combat as green lightning, waves of kinetic force, or green flames that melt ceramite armor. All powered not by any individual warp connection, but by the collective enthusiasm of every Ork within range. The downside is that if too much energy builds without discharge, the Weird Boy's head explodes. This can trigger a psychic cascade causing nearby Orks' heads to explode as well. This is classified as a tactical liability by Imperial military doctrine and is highly entertaining by the Orks who survive to describe it afterward. Says chaos corruption struggles with Orks in ways that frustrate the dark gods. Chaos requires vulnerabilities, fear to exploit, ambition to corrupt, despair to deepen. The Ork psychic field is a closed loop of simple enthusiasm. There is no fear in it, no ambition beyond the immediate desire for a better fight, no despair at all. The The whispered promises that make other species vulnerable to chaos do not find purchase in a consciousness entirely occupied with anticipating the next engagement. Orks are, by their nature, psychically inoculated against corruption, not through faith or purity or the complex spiritual armor that the imperial faith provides to its followers, through the simple absence of the psychological gaps that chaos requires to enter. The orc does not wonder whether this is all worth it. The orc does not fear death. Yes, the orc does not want more than what it has, because what it has is a fight, and a fight is enough. Section 5. Society, hierarchy, and the fist that rules. Look at orc society from a distance, and you might see chaos, shouting, brawling, constant noise, things being built and broken and rebuilt, arguments that end in violence, violence that ends in allegiances, allegiances that end in more arguments. But this impression misses the underlying structure, which is physical rather than institutional and consequently far more durable than any institutional arrangement humanity has produced. The organizing principle of orc civilization is mass. The biggest orc is the boss. Not because anyone voted, not because of inheritance, not because of formal appointment or accumulated social credit. Because it is the biggest, and in orc biology, size is an advertisement of survival success, written in muscle and scar tissue. The biggest orc has survived the most fighting. The most fighting has grown it the most. The growth is the proof of capability. The proof of capability is why everyone else follows. It is elegant in the way that very simple systems can be elegant. No corruption, no graming, no way to achieve the position without actually having done the things the position is supposed to represent. This creates an elegantly self-correcting system. If a boss stops winning, it stops growing, while rivals keep fighting and keep growing. Eventually, someone else becomes biggest. That someone takes over. The transition is brief and violent. The new boss is in charge. Everyone accepts this because it is simply how things are. Guess the orc does not experience this transition as a tragedy or a betrayal. It experiences it as physics, the thing that happens when a bigger force meets a smaller one, and the outcome follows naturally from the difference in size. This is not as simple as it sounds in practice, because orc social advancement has creative layers. The most ambitious orcs have learned that sometimes the fastest path to the top is removing competition rather than outlasting it. Conveniently arranged battlefield accidents, rivals mysteriously positioned in the path of heavy fire, suggestions to the war boss that a particular troublesome knob should lead the next suicidal charge, poison fungus beer, though administering this requires getting close enough to a large and suspicious orc to add something to its drink, which is its own kind of challenge. These are all recognized tools of the informal orc political curriculum, discussed openly and viewed without judgment, because the goal is still to be the last one standing. The methods are merely creative expressions of the same underlying principle. At the base level, the mob, a fluid group of orcs bound by shared combat style and the authority of their strongest member. Several mobs under a capable leader form a warband. Multiple warbands form a tribe, and when a warboss grows dominant enough that other warbosses and their tribes begin acknowledging its authority, it has become a warlord, and its campaign has become something larger, a great crusade that takes on a life of its own. This crusade generates a self-reinforcing cycle. More orcs join, the gestalt field intensifies, orc technology works better, its victories become more impressive, more orcs are attracted from across nearby space, the field intensifies further, a positive feedback loop of violence that, if left unchecked, can consume entire sectors within a single generation. The critical question is always how long the warlord survives and how quickly the next one rises. A warlord who dies before the crusade has reached critical mass, before the field has grown intense enough and the gathered forces large enough to sustain themselves, ends the crusade. The mobs disperse, the warbands fracture, the carefully accumulated momentum dissipates into 100 smaller conflicts. The crusade was real while it lasted, but it is gone now, and the process has to start again somewhere else. Many crusades end this way. The failure rate is high. That is not a reason for comfort, seen because the ones that do not fail continue growing indefinitely. Below ordinary orcs in this hierarchy sit the Gretchen, smaller and more cunning, the administrative class of greenskin civilization. The orc cannot function without grots. The logistics, the counting, the management of supplies, the carrying of ammunition, the running of errands, the holding of things, while the orc figures out how to hit them. All of this falls to the Gretchen population. But the orc also cannot respect the grot, because the grot is small, and small things are not respected in orc society. So, the grot lives in a permanent state of essential service and casual contempt, doing the necessary work while being kicked for the pleasure of any orc that walks past. The grot resents this deeply and has absolutely no power to change it, which generates a simmering and creative resentment that has produced some of the more interesting tactical complications in orc military history. Gretchen have, on multiple recorded occasions, caused significant problems for orc campaigns by applying their cunning and their resentment simultaneously. A Gretchen who has been kicked one time too many and who controls the ammunition storage for an entire warband has more leverage than it appears. This leverage is rarely applied successfully because the response to a Gretchen who gets ideas is typically simple and immediate. But the attempts themselves are documented. Below the grots are the snotlings, maintaining the fungus gardens and spore beds that form the nutritional and reproductive foundation of any orc settlement. Below snotlings are the squigs, the biological Swiss Army knife of the orc ecosystem. Eating squigs provide protein. Oil squigs provide lubricant from their nasal glands. Facebiter squigs function as attack animals and status symbols. Musical squig pipes are exactly what they sound like, and represent a genuinely alarming contribution to orc musical culture. The squig exists in dozens of distinct forms, each serving a different function in the orc war camp, each emerging from the same basic spore-based ecosystem that generates everything else. The resilience of this social structure is its defining quality. There are no fragile institutions, no single points of failure, no exposed infrastructure. You cannot use propaganda on a society that does not process information through the channels propaganda is designed to exploit. Yet you cannot cause economic collapse by targeting the currency system, because the currency grows back in every orc's mouth. You cannot destabilize leadership by assassination, because the leadership simply reforms around whoever is biggest after the dust settles. The orc social order is self-repairing. Damage it, and it snaps back almost immediately, usually in a slightly different configuration that has already adapted to whatever just tried to break it. Section 6. The 6 Great Clans. Identity in Green. Not every orc is the same, even within the common framework of being large, green, and committed to violence as a lifestyle. The 6 Great Clans of the orc race represent the major cultural subdivisions of green-skinned civilization, each with its own aesthetic, preferred mode of combat, and distinct reputation within the broader community. Understanding the clans is understanding the texture of orc culture, the variety that exists beneath the surface uniformity of the green tide. The Goths believe that the most orcish thing you can do is walk directly at a problem until it stops being a problem. They are the heavy infantry, the shock troops, the believers in the philosophy that close combat is the pure and honest form of war, and that any engagement which ends with the enemy still beyond arm's reach has not been properly finished. Their black and white checkered heraldry marks them as warriors who have committed to the personal, messy, entirely honest work of fighting. They distrust shooting as indirect, distrust vehicles as putting unnecessary machinery between an orc and the satisfaction of direct physical contact with an enemy. A Goth's ideal battle ends with the enemy directly beneath its feet. Ghazghkull Thraka himself is a Goth, which tells you everything about what the clan values and what it is capable of producing when the values align with the right individual at the right moment. Goth warbands are the terrifying wall that hits an enemy formation and simply does not stop. They absorb casualties at rates that would break other armies and advance through them, because advancing is what Goths do, and stopping is not a concept they have much patience for. The psychology of a Goth assault is the psychology of a force that has decided the physical distance between itself and the enemy is an insult that needs to be corrected immediately. The Evil Sons are the Goths' philosophical opposite. They value speed above everything else. Red vehicles, red armor, but red everything, because red goes faster, and the Evil Sons live to go fast. Their warbands are built around bikes, buggies, trucks, and anything else that can be made to move at an unsafe velocity towards something soft and surprised. The appeal of the Evil Sons approach is the specific and irreplaceable experience of a very high-speed collision with something that did not expect you to be moving that fast. Their raids are characterized by the sound arriving before the image, the roar of engines preceding the visual of the incoming wave by only enough time to begin being afraid, but not enough time to do anything useful about it. Speed freaks, the informal cult within Evil Sun's culture, take this to its logical extreme. They modify their vehicles obsessively, stripping anything that adds weight without adding speed, and adding anything that adds speed without adding too much weight, and operating with the focused clarity of beings who have decided that velocity is the highest virtue. The physics of what they build and how they drive it should result in catastrophic mechanical failure on a constant basis. The Gestalt field has other opinions. The Bad Moons are the wealthy clan, distinguished by the fact that their teeth grow faster than any other clans. Since teeth are currency in Orc society, and since the rate of tooth growth is fixed by biology, faster tooth growth means natural financial advantage, and the Bad Moons pursue that advantage with an enthusiasm that borders on exhibition. Gold paint is the first sign of a Bad Moon presence. Extravagant weapons, elaborate clothing, the finest squig meat available, the most powerful guns that teeth can buy. And the Bad Moon always has more teeth than anyone else. They exist to be seen, to be known as the most expensive thing on the battlefield. The ostentatious display is not vanity for its own sake. It is advertising. It is saying, I had enough teeth to afford all of this, which means I am clearly the most successful orc in this room, which means you should probably be fighting beside me rather than against me. The Blood Axes are the suspicious clan, viewed with wariness by their peers because they do things that proper orcs are not supposed to do. They use camouflage. They plan. They are willing to observe an enemy before attacking it. They have been known to trade with humans, which is by orc standards the most questionable possible behavior. Said they read human military tactics not to admire them, but because understanding how a thing fights helps you fight it better. By orc community standards, this is deeply troubling. War is supposed to be straightforward. You go at it, and the best one wins. The Blood Axes introduce complications that make other orcs uncomfortable, but the Blood Axes survive. Their survival rate in difficult conditions significantly exceeds clans that rely on direct assault without preparation. Their campaigns tend to be more efficient, their objectives more clearly achieved, their casualties lower relative to outcomes. They are the most effective orcs in any context, where effectiveness is defined as winning with the minimum necessary expenditure of orc bodies, which, admittedly, is not how most orcs define effectiveness, which is why the Blood Axes remain viewed with suspicion despite their track record. The Snakebites are the traditionalists, the clan that has decided that most advanced technology is overrated and that a good warboar and a solid choppa are all any self-respecting orc needs. Covered in snake tattoos, having developed a cultural practice of deliberately taking venomous bites to build tolerance and accumulate what they consider spiritual strength, more comfortable riding into battle on enormous beasts than in any mechanical vehicle, the Snakebites occupy a fundamentalist position in orc culture. They are what orcs were before mech boys started making things complicated, and they believe this is a point in their favor. Their point has merit. A snakebite mob that has lost all its equipment is still a dangerous mob. And a speed freak whose vehicle has been destroyed is just a confused orc standing next to fire. The Death Skulls are the thieves, the looters, the beings who see a battlefield as an opportunity for resource acquisition. They paint themselves blue for luck, and within the logic of the Gestalt field, this may actually work. Blue things being lucky is orc cultural consensus, and orc cultural consensus has consequences for physical reality. Their style reflects their philosophy: acquire, repurpose, deploy. A Death Skull mob arriving at a fight with alien weapons they stole from the last fight, riding vehicles assembled from components looted from 3 different prior engagements, is not an unusual sight. They are the recyclers of the orc ecosystem, the beings that turn the waste of war into the raw material of the next war. As all 6 clans exist within the broader orc tribal structure, their members mixing freely under a war boss's authority. A single warband might contain Goths in the front rank, Evil Suns on bikes providing fast attack, Bad Moons lobbing expensive explosive shells from the rear, and Death Skulls picking over everything that falls. The diversity of capability this produces is one of the reasons orc warbands are so difficult to counter with a single tactical approach. Section 7. The Specialist Caste, Odd Boys and Their Gifts. The question of how orc civilization sustains itself technically, medically, and psychically given that it has no schools, no universities, no accumulated institutional knowledge in any form a human civilization would recognize, is answered by the Tensu. It is ended by the technogene, a genetic sequence that activates in certain orcs as they mature and releases into their consciousness a body of instinctive knowledge in a specific field. No school, no teachers, no accumulated institutional wisdom, just the genome doing what it was designed to do, creating specialists from the raw material of ordinary orcs. The mech boys are the engineers of the orc race, beings who woke up one day already knowing how to build things, not theoretically. The spatial reasoning, the mechanical intuition, the understanding of how systems work together, all of it arrives fully formed as the technogene activates. A mech boy, looking at a pile of scrap, sees what it could become with a clarity that has nothing to do with learned skill and everything to do with biological architecture. It sees configurations that would not occur to minds trained in conventional engineering, and it builds them, supported by the gestalt field that makes its conviction that the thing will work translate directly into the thing working. The results populate the galaxy's battlefields with objects that should not exist. Trucks welded from salvaged components that function better than the sum of their parts. Battle wagons carrying enough firepower to embarrass main battle tanks, held together by a combination of crude welds and pure orc confidence. The Gargant, a walking war machine of enormous scale, built by mech boys who received their design in a vision from Gork and Mork at the onset of a great crusade, its construction requiring no blueprints because the blueprint is in the mech boy's head and the head works fine. Into the shock attack gun deserves its own moment of attention. It fires snotlings through the warp. The snotlings travel through warp space, experiencing horrors that no creature was designed to experience, and emerge inside enemy vehicles and fortifications in a state of complete psychological dissolution, meaning they are extremely angry, terrified, and violent in enclosed spaces that their targets were not prepared to defend. This is the orc solution to the problem of penetrating hardened positions. It is, by the standards of warp-adjacent technology in the 41st millennium, genuinely inventive, unpleasant for everyone involved, but genuinely inventive. The snotlings feel very strongly that it is unpleasant for them specifically, but no one is asking the snotlings. Big mechs, the most senior mech boys, create even stranger devices. The custom force field generates a protective bubble of psychically reinforced energy around nearby orcs. The mega armor worn by the most heavily armed orc combatants is, mechanically, something that the Adeptus Mechanicus has examined and declined to fully explain, categorizing it as functioning through mechanisms they are not prepared to document in official literature. A big mech who has been building things for decades exists in a state of accumulated technical understanding that goes beyond the technogene's initial gift, incorporating experience into expertise in ways that produce truly unusual outcomes. The Pain Boys carry the same kind of instinctive expertise in the field of medicine. They know where the organs are, how they connect, how to manage the biological disasters that orc combat produces on a regular basis. Is head transplants, bionic limb replacements, experimental cybernetic modifications that were not requested by the patient and are not reversible after the fact. The Pain Boys' enthusiasm for its craft is total and entirely unconstrained by any concern for patient comfort or informed consent. Orc biology's extraordinary resilience makes this survivable in the majority of cases, and the minority of cases are rarely reported because the minority of cases are not in a position to report anything. Mad Doc Grotznik, the most notorious of all orc medical practitioners, rebuilt Ghazghkull Thraka's shattered skull in adamantium after a bolter round destroyed roughly 30% of the future warlord's brain. Whatever Grotznik installed alongside the structural repair gave Ghazghkull the capacity to receive visions from Gork and Mork themselves, in clear and detailed visions of a unified orc empire sweeping the galaxy. Whether this was medical intention or a side effect of Grotznik's characteristic surgical creativity is a question that nobody has been able to answer, partly because asking Grotznik directly tends to end in the questioner becoming a patient. The Runthirds are the keepers of the Gretchen and Snotling populations, the wranglers of the smaller orcoid species who form the logistical backbone of any orc warband. Their expertise is not technical but psychological. They understand the grot mind, its resentments, and its cunning, and they manage it through a combination of incentives and threats calibrated to maintain the Gretchen's essential contributions without allowing the Grot's natural cunning to manifest in ways that are inconvenient for the war effort. Sirrundards carry squig goads and nets, and, more importantly, a deep understanding of where the line is between a Grot that is well managed and one that is planning something. The Weird Boys are the living psychic batteries of Orc society, absorbing gestalt energy from surrounding mobs and discharging it in combat. Their power scales directly with the number of Orcs around them, making them dramatically more dangerous in large gatherings and essentially useless in isolation. A Weird Boy separated from its warband is an ordinary Orc with a headache. A Weird Boy in the middle of a crusade of 10,000 is a disaster that can melt armor at range and collapse fortifications with direct psychic force. Yet the main hazard of the profession is overload. Too much absorbed energy without discharge produces a catastrophic failure of biological containment. Warpheads, Weird Boys who have crossed into addiction to their own power, actively seek situations that will produce maximum energy absorption. They are persistent tactical unpredictability in physical form, beloved by every Orc near them for what they can do, and quietly feared by those same Orcs for the head explosion risk. Section 8. The Culture of War, Gork, Mork, Teef, and the Great Green. Every civilization needs a mythology, a framework of meaning that explains why things are the way they are, and why the behaviors the civilization values are the right behaviors to value. Human civilizations have produced thousands of mythologies, and each rich with explanations for suffering and hope and mortality and purpose. The Orc mythology is considerably more focused. It is essentially the story of two gods, a single sacred substance, and one ongoing ritual that has lasted 60 million years. Gork and Mork are the Orc gods. They are not subtle. They do not deal in metaphor. They are, in the most direct possible sense, enormous Orcs, the biggest Orcs there are. Cosmic-scale Orcs who are currently somewhere in the immaterium, having the most epic fight in the history of the universe with each other. The theological question that occupies Orc philosophical discourse, to the extent that such a thing exists, is which of them is which. Gork is brutally cunning, and Mork is cunningly brutal, and the distinction is meaningful. Both are to be honored, both are to be embodied in combat. An Orc that fights with pure brute force and no tactics is paying tribute to Gork. An Orc that uses its head, plans a little, tries to be clever, is paying tribute to Mork. Most Orcs want to be doing both simultaneously, because most Orcs have a healthy reverence for being both violent and smart about being violent. The theology does not require temples or priests. The Orcs themselves, fighting, are the worship. Every charge and every tactical maneuver and every well-placed explosive is a prayer. Every great crusade is a religious event. The Orc does not worship by sitting quietly and reflecting on the divine. The Orc worships by doing exactly what the divine demands, which is fighting and fighting well. Weird Boys and the most senior war bosses occasionally report receiving direct communication from Gork and Mork. And not metaphorical divine inspiration, but actual content. Visions of specific battlefields, instructions about specific tactics, confirmation that a particular direction of advance will end in the right kind of glorious chaos. Ghazghkull Thraka's visions of a unified Orc empire began after Grotznik's work on his skull and have guided his campaigns across decades and across worlds. Whether these communications are genuine warp phenomena, the output of Grotznik's unusual surgical contribution, the product of a mind interpreting its own instincts through a theological framework, or some combination of all three is a question that the lore leaves deliberately open. The effect is the same regardless of the origin. The economic system of the Orcs is built around teeth. Orc teeth fall out and regrow constantly throughout an Orc's life, and at a rate that varies by individual and by clan. A tooth is worth roughly what it weighs, and larger Orcs have larger teeth. Successful Orcs who have grown large have valuable teeth. Failed Orcs, who have not grown as much, have less valuable teeth. The currency is therefore a direct representation of social standing and success in the very activity that Orc society values, which is fighting. You cannot accumulate wealth by not being a good fighter. The economy embodies the values. The TIF economy is also essentially inflation-proof in ways that human economists find deeply interesting when they are not being killed. Everyone with teeth is generating currency at a biological rate. The total amount of teeth in circulation grows proportionally with the orc population. No single entity can corner the supply. So the bad moons have an advantage because their teeth grow faster, but they cannot permanently dominate the economy because everyone else's teeth are also growing and can always, in principle, simply take the bad moon's wealth by the most direct available means. The pursuit of a great crusade is, in orc theological terms, the highest possible form of devotion. A warlord who gathers a sufficiently large force and launches it at a worthy target is not conducting a military campaign. The orc is staging a religious festival. The largest crusades in orc history, the ones that consumed entire sectors and threatened civilizations, were understood by their participants not as wars in any political sense, but as the Great Green itself moving through the galaxy, expressing its fundamental nature on the largest possible canvas. Orc art, such as it is, reflects this culture perfectly. Frescoes of battle painted on the sides of vehicles, trophies from fallen enemies displayed on armor and weapons, the squigpipe music that accompanies an orc advance, a sound that has been described by survivors as somewhere between industrial noise and something that should not physically be able to produce the emotional effect it produces. Orc poetry, which exists, is almost exclusively about either fighting or eating, or both simultaneously. The aesthetic tradition is entirely consistent. What is beautiful is what works, and what works is what fights, and what fights is what wins. Section 9. The War of the Beast. When orcs nearly won, if you want to understand what the orcs are capable of, when everything goes right or wrong depending on your perspective, you look at one event above all others in the long and bloody history of the Imperium of Man. You look at the War of the Beast, and you hold very still, and you think carefully about what it means. The year is approximately 544 of the 32nd millennium. The Imperium is in a period that history will later describe as relatively stable, which in the context of the 40,000 setting means it is only being destroyed in a moderate number of places simultaneously. No Horus heresy, no Great Rift. The imperial bureaucracy is functioning within its normal parameters of dysfunction, and then, without meaningful warning, every orc population in the galaxy simultaneously goes silent. The silence lasts for a period that imperial observers can reconstruct in retrospect, but did not fully understand as it was happening, and then the silence ends. Almost something wakes up in orc space, something vast, something that announces its arrival by destroying several star systems, not fighting for them, destroying them, the worlds themselves, by constructing attack moons, artificial satellite constructions of immense size used as weapons capable of destroying planets. And these attack moons begin moving toward the Imperium. The scale of the invasion that followed exceeded any orc assault in recorded human history. It exceeded, by orders of magnitude, anything the Imperium's military doctrine was designed to handle. World after world fell. System after system burned. The attacks were coordinated in ways that orc attacks are not supposed to be coordinated, striking simultaneously at multiple fronts. Adapting to imperial countermeasures with a tactical flexibility that military historians studying the records afterward consistently describe as incompatible with the intelligence level of a normal orc commander. The warboss behind all of this was known only as the Beast. He was enormous. Not in the way that successful warbosses are typically large. He was enormous by a different standard entirely, described in accounts that have survived from this period as the size of a hab block, making ordinary orc warbosses look like children standing next to adults. His size was the first shock. The second shock was that he could speak perfect High Gothic, fluent, educated, grammatically impeccable High Gothic. Not a few crude words bellowed in challenge, the kind of Gothic a diplomat or a senior imperial officer uses, one deployed by an orc whose army was threatening Terra itself, delivered in messages that the Imperium was forced to receive and respond to because the alternative was not receiving them, and the attack moons would continue their advance regardless. This was not an unusually large warboss who had happened to develop some language skills. This was evidence that the dormant genetic potential of the ancient Krork, locked away in the orc genome for 60 million years, was beginning to reassert itself. The Beast was becoming what the Krork had been: larger, smarter, more sophisticated, more like the weapons the old ones had designed, and less like the diminished descendants those weapons had become over millions of years of aimless fighting. He had unified the Ork race behind him to a degree that had not been seen since the War in Heaven. And he had done it with deliberate strategic intent. His capital was built on Ulanor Prime, specifically at the location where the Emperor and his Primarchs had celebrated the Ulanor Crusade over 1,000 years earlier. This was not coincidence. It was a statement. The beast knew his history. He had built his throne at the site of the greatest Ork humiliation of the modern era, at the place where the Emperor himself had stood and declared victory over the Green Tide, and the message was entirely intentional. The Green Tide had returned. The victory had been temporary. And the Emperor was not here to do anything about it. The Imperial response was everything that the Imperium could muster. The Imperial fists were nearly annihilated. Captain Corland, ultimately the sole survivor of his chapter, became the symbol of Imperial resistance, eventually assuming the title Lord Commander of the Imperium in the absence of effective leadership from the High Lords of Terra, who were in that period demonstrating all of the political dysfunction that made the High Lords of Terra historically difficult to be governed by. Corland forged the Death Watch into a more formidable organization. He organized not one, but 3 separate invasions of Ulanor. The first 2 failed. The second invasion revealed that there was not one beast, but 6 prime orcs of equal power, each commanding an army, deliberately organized in mockery of the emperors and his primarchs. 6 beings, each as large as the beast, each capable of the same strategic sophistication, each leading forces that could themselves threaten a sector independently of the others. The Primarch Vulcan, one of the Emperor's sons, was one of the demigod commanders of the Space Marine Legions, personally confronted the beast in its temple gargant during the 3rd invasion of Ulanor. The confrontation ended when Vulcan destroyed the building in an explosion that apparently consumed them both. Whether Vulcan survived this event and what happened to him afterward is a story in itself, but the immediate outcome was the death of at least one of the Prime Orcs and the collapse of the coordinated command structure that had made the Orc assault so devastatingly effective. The aftermath was sobering. The Imperium had won, technically. The attack moons were eventually neutralized. The Prime Orcs were eventually slain. The unified Orc Crusade fragmented, as Orc Crusades without adequate leadership always eventually fragment. Yet the cost had been the near destruction of multiple Space Marine chapters, the loss of countless worlds, and an Imperial military establishment left so weakened that the period following the War of the Beast is sometimes characterized as an era of slow recovery from wounds that never fully healed. The subsequent order to destroy Ulanor Prime entirely, to render the planet completely uninhabitable, was a response to what had been found there. An Orc civilization so advanced that the Adeptus Mechanicus was formally requesting permission to study it before the destruction order was carried out. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the organization dedicated to preserving and developing the most sophisticated technology in human history, wanted to study the ruins of an Orc civilization. The order was eventually executed. Ulanor Prime was destroyed. The Imperium buried the memory as thoroughly as it could. The lesson remained, unspoken and uncomfortable. The Orcs, properly unified under the right leader, could win. They could end the Imperium. That had been demonstrated as a fact, not a hypothetical, in a conflict that most of humanity's descendants would never be taught had happened at all. Section 10. Ghazghkull Thraka, the Prophet of Green Fire. In the late 41st millennium, there is one name among the Orcs that every species in the galaxy has learned to fear, not because of what has already happened, though what has already happened is genuinely catastrophic, but because of what appears to be coming. His full name is Ghazghkull Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, the war boss who has led 2 separate invasions of Armageddon that between them are among the largest conventional military engagements in the history of the Imperium of Man, the warlord who has unified more greenskins under a single banner than any commander since the Beast, and who appears, by every physical and strategic indicator available, to be in the process of becoming something the galaxy has not seen in thousands of years. He began his career as an ordinary Orc boy on the unremarkable world of Urk, serving under a Death Skull's war boss named Dregmek. His transformation began when a Space Marine bolt-around destroyed roughly 30% of his brain during a battle against automated defenses. He survived because the notorious pain boy Mad Doc Grotznik rebuilt his shattered skull in adamantium and, in the process, he has apparently installed something additional that gave Ghazghkull something unprecedented: genuine, sustained, detailed visions from Gork and Mork themselves. Not the vague impressions and dream fragments that weird boys occasionally describe. Clear, specific, strategically useful visions of a unified orc empire sweeping the galaxy. Every species crushed beneath the green tide, Gork and Mork tearing through the boundary between the warp and reality to join the greatest battle ever fought. He saw it clearly, and he decided to make it real. His rise on Urk had a direction to it that most orc campaigns lack. He defeated Dregmek not through a single dramatic triumph, but through sustained pressure. Yes, the patience of a being who had seen the end of the story and understood that the path to it was long and required sustained momentum rather than spectacular single moments. He unified the clans one by one, defeated their bosses in ways that left an impression of inevitability rather than chance, built his council of clan bosses as an organization that would survive his absence, and then announced his intention to leave Urk entirely. The statement of ambition this represented, an orc declaring that one entire planet was no longer a sufficient canvas for its activities, gave the whole enterprise the quality of a religious undertaking. Orcs from across the system began converging on Urk to join something that felt, in the logic of the gestalt field, like it was already happening regardless of whether they participated. At the First War for Armageddon in 941 of the 41st millennium was the opening declaration. Armageddon, one of the most heavily defended hive worlds in the Imperium, home to billions, defended by one of the best prepared and best equipped Imperial Guard presences in the sector, protected by Space Marine chapters who were among the finest the Imperium produced, was brought to its knees. The Blood Angels came, the Salamanders came. Massive concentrations of Imperial Guard deployed and fought with everything they had. The war lasted long enough to leave Armageddon permanently scarred, and it ended not because the Imperium defeated Ghazghkull, but because Ghazghkull became bored with the grinding stalemate. He left. He had bigger things to attend to. He would return. The relationship that developed between Ghazghkull and the Imperial Commissar Sebastian Yarrick across subsequent decades is one of the stranger dynamics in the lore. Yarrick was the human who made Armageddon worth fighting, a man of such personal ferocity and leadership that Ghazghkull, who had no reason to respect anything about humans, respected him specifically. When Ghazghkull captured Yarrick on Golgotha, he released him. Not out of mercy in any human sense, not out of sentiment, because returning to Armageddon would mean nothing if Yarrick was not there to oppose him. Yarrick was the worthy opponent. Yarrick was the part of the fight that made the fight worth having. Killing him now would be wasteful, a premature end to a story that had not finished yet. Yet this is the orc relationship with worthy opponents rendered explicit. The enemy is not something to be destroyed and forgotten. A good enemy is something to be preserved and returned to, because the enemy is part of the point. He returned in 998 of the 41st millennium for the Third War for Armageddon, with a force that dwarfed even the first invasion. The battles were the most destructive in the planet's history. Entire hive cities were contested room by room and block by block for months. The greenskin numbers never seemed to diminish regardless of how many were killed in any given engagement. When events in the wider galaxy prompted Ghazghkull to move on, Armageddon was left in a state from which it has not recovered, its battlefield still churning with ongoing conflict that outlasted the warlord's direct interest. What makes Ghazghkull truly alarming is not any single campaign, but the trajectory. Every physical representation of him in the lore has been larger than the previous one, and this growth is explicitly in-universe, not merely scale inflation from different artistic renditions. He is growing. He is gathering followers at a rate that exceeds any previous warlord of the modern era. The gestalt field surrounding his crusade is intensifying. The ancient genetic potential of the Krork is expressing itself more fully with each passing year in response to the scale of what he is sustaining. There is a detail in the lore that deserves emphasis. After several encounters with Inquisitors and Space Marines attempting to halt his advance, including at least one instance of his physical body being definitively destroyed, Ghazghkull returned. Mad Doc Grotznik, still active, retrieved his head and built him a new body. The head is what matters. The consciousness persists. The visions continue. The crusade continues because the prophet of Gork and Mork does not die when his body is destroyed. He takes a brief biological pause and then continues. He is on the path to becoming what the beast was, a nascent Krork, a return to the original form. And if the conditions of the 41st millennium, with the Great Rift blazing across the sky and conflicts erupting on every front, continue to provide the kind of sustained high-intensity warfare that the Ork genome was designed to respond to, that path leads somewhere that the Imperium and the rest of the galaxy is not prepared for. As Section 11, the Octarius War, the galaxy's most dangerous arms race. The most dangerous decisions in history are often made with the best available intentions. Inquisitor Fetus Cryptman, watching Hive Fleet Leviathans advance in the closing years of the 41st millennium and running casualty projections that exceeded the Imperium's capacity to respond through conventional means, made a decision that was rational, defensible, and profoundly consequential. He would use the Orks. The Tyranids are driven partly by the trail of psychic signals left by their Genestealer cult vanguards, spread ahead of the main fleet to prepare worlds for consumption. Cryptomen led Deathwatch kill teams to capture a live Genestealer brood in stasis containment, then transported them to the heart of the Ork Empire of Octarius, or one of the most densely populated greenskin territories in the galaxy, and released them. The Genestealer cult that grew from this seeding acted as a psychic lure. The Tyranid instinct to follow the trail of a Genestealer infestation drew Leviathan's tendrils directly toward Octarius. The two most dangerous forces in the galaxy locked into each other. The Ork Empire consumed the Tyranid assault's full attention, and the immediate pressure on the wider Imperium decreased. What Cryptman had correctly calculated was that the two forces would engage. What he may have underestimated was the specific nature of what sustained conflict does to both Orks and Tyranids simultaneously. The Tyranids adapt biologically to overcome resistance, incorporating successful genetic strategies from the creatures they fight into their own evolutionary archive. As a hive fleet that has fought against space marines long enough starts producing bioforms with natural resistance to bolter rounds, thickened chitin against plasma weapons, behavioral adaptations against the specific tactical patterns of Astartes assault. This is the Tyranid gift, the most sophisticated and rapid biological adaptation system in the galaxy. The Orks grow through battle. Physically, psychologically, psychically, they respond to combat pressure by becoming better at surviving it. The harder the fight, the greater the growth. The longer the sustained engagement, the more the ancient potential in the Ork genome unlocks. Both processes ran simultaneously in Octarius for years. In a self-accelerating arms race between the most biologically sophisticated adaptive species in the galaxy and the most psychically enhanced growth-through-combat species in the galaxy. The Ork forces at the front lines of the Octarius War became, by the time Imperial observers managed to assess them, something categorically different from baseline greenskins. Knobs, the physical size of normal war bosses. Ordinary Ork boys significantly larger than they should be for their apparent age. Warriors forged by years of constant selection pressure, survivors of battles that culled everything, not fast, tough, or vicious enough to keep fighting, growing continuously in response to the intensity of the field, generated by the scale of the conflict. All the gestalt field in the Octarius sector reached intensities that made local physics genuinely unreliable by ordinary standards. The Tyranids adapted in turn. New bioforms developed that incorporated responses to Ork physiology specifically, resistance to the toughness that made Orks so hard to kill, behavioral adaptations to the gestalt field, bioforms designed to operate effectively in environments where local reality was being subtly reinforced by collective Ork belief, synaptic refinements that addressed the specific ways Ork combat tactics operated. A hive fleet that entered Octarius as one of the most dangerous in recorded history was refined through the crucible of Ork warfare into something more precisely lethal. The eventual outcome saw the Swarmlord, the Tyranid's most powerful battlefield intelligence, then direct a final campaign that brought down the Overfiend of Octarius. The Ork capital fell. Leviathan consumed the biomass of the empire it had fought so hard to reach, but both participants emerged from Octarius more dangerous than they had entered it. The Tyranids had learned to fight Orks at scale. The Ork survivors, scattered across the surrounding space in numbers that no annihilation campaign fully addressed, carried the experience of years of sustained combat against one of the galaxy's apex predators. They were harder, more capable, and now dispersed without central leadership across a region of space that was going to need to deal with them. Krypton was censured by the Inquisition for engineering a conflict that consumed billions of lives on both sides. Yes, the more practical critique is simpler. It worked tactically and created a strategic situation that may be significantly worse in the long run than the original problem it was designed to address. The galaxy around Octarius is now populated by battle-hardened greenskins looking for new challenges. The Tyranids emerging from it are harder to kill. Neither outcome suggests the calculation fully accounted for what was being set in motion. There is a broader principle at work in the Octarius War that extends beyond the specific conflict. The instinct to weaponize Orks, to point them at a problem and let the problem take care of both the Orks and itself, is recurring in Imperial strategic thinking. It almost always produces short-term results and medium to long-term complications of a severity that the short-term thinking did not budget for. But the Orks are not a controllable tool. They are a force that can be redirected, sometimes for a period, toward a specific target. But the force does not stop when the target is eliminated. It continues, stronger for having engaged the target, looking for the next thing to fight, having been enhanced rather than depleted by the experience of combat. Section 12. Why the Orks are the most terrifying. The closing case. We have traveled far in this exploration. From the war in heaven 60 million years ago, to the workshops of Ghazghkull, to the burning surface of Armageddon, to the grinding horror of Octarius. We have built a picture, piece by careful piece, of what the Orks truly are, what they were made from, what they are made of, how they fight, why they fight, what happens when they are given the right conditions. Let me now make the case for why, among all the terrors of the 41st millennium, the Orks may be the most fundamentally threatening of all, not the most individually powerful. The Chaos Gods predate the current form of the universe, not the most inexorable. The Tyranids are a biomechanical extinction event of galactic scale, not the most technologically overwhelming. The Necrons have access to abilities that make everything else in the setting look primitive, not the most ancient. The Satan fragments existed before the galaxy had stars in the conventional sense, but the most terrifying in the specific and precise sense of the thing that should frighten you most when you think carefully about what it actually means for everyone else. The Orks cannot be solved. Every other great threat has a theoretical endpoint. Yet you can construct a scenario where the Tyranids are starved, where the hive mind is disrupted. You can imagine chaos weakened, the psychic balance tipping toward order. You can imagine the Necrons completing their awakening and returning to empire building, governed by the political logic that stabilized empires use. Each of these threats has a shape to it, a logic, something you could in principle push against. The Orks do not have an endpoint. They are a permanent condition of the galaxy, written into the biology of 60 million years of self-replication, seeded across every world they have ever touched. You cannot destroy them all, because you would have to find every spore, in every patch of soil, on every planet where Orks have ever fought and died, across a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of star systems. You cannot outpace their reproduction across the totality of their presence. You cannot corrupt them because their psychology has no gap for corruption to enter. You cannot negotiate a permanent peace because peace is not what they were designed for, and 60 million years of design does not respond to negotiation. They were designed for the war in heaven, for a conflict meant to continue until the enemy was completely eliminated or the Krork were. That war ended. The enemy retreated. But the weapon did not stop. It has been running for 60 million years without its original target, fighting everything available, filling the galaxy with the continuous background presence of green war. And it is not winding down. It is accelerating. Yet the growth mechanism is the key, the ancient genetic inheritance that responds to the scale of conflict by scaling the Orks themselves. Every great crusade, every massive engagement, every sustained campaign of the kind that the 41st millennium is generating on multiple fronts simultaneously is providing exactly the conditions that the Ork genome was designed to respond to. Every war the orcs fight, every battle that hardens them and grows their leaders, every dead orc whose spores seed the next generation, all of it is pushing the species toward something, toward what they were at the beginning, before the devolution, before 60 million years of aimless fighting ground down the Krork into their diminished modern form. There is a phoenix waiting in the orc genome, not a metaphorical one, a literal genetic reawakening, a return to form, and a moment when the right conditions unlock the potential that has been sleeping for 60 million years. Ghazghkull Thraka's ongoing growth, the physical expansion documented across decades of encounters, is not an anomaly. It is a preview. The conditions of the 41st millennium look, from the perspective of the orc genome, very much like the conditions that should trigger the full expression of what the genome was designed to produce. A war boss growing larger with each passing year, a crusade gathering followers at extraordinary speed, a gestalt field intensifying in response to the scale of the gathering. The ancient mathematics of Old One biological engineering beginning to return results that have not been computed for 60 million years. The last great weapon of a dead civilization, still running, still growing, and still looking for the enemy it was made to fight. And the universe, all these billions of years later, has plenty to offer. The story of the orcs is a story about purpose, about what happens when something is designed so well for a specific function that it cannot stop fulfilling that function even when the context that gave it meaning has been gone for 60 million years. It is a story about the persistence of design, about the ghost of intent that lives in biology long after the mind that shaped it has returned to dust. A weapon that outlasted its makers, its purpose, and its original enemy, and is still running because running is what it was built to do. There is something almost philosophical about the orcs' continued existence, something that puts the entire 41st millennium in a different light if you let yourself sit with it. The Imperium of Man is 10,000 years old and considers itself ancient. The Aeldari are hundreds of thousands of years old and consider themselves a dying civilization burdened by history. The Necrons slept for 60 million years and consider themselves the rightful inheritors of a galaxy that has moved on without them. And the orcs have been fighting continuously since before any of these civilizations were imagined by anyone. The orcs are older than the Imperium, the way the ocean is older than the ship crossing it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the orcs are not an aberration. They are the point. They are what the galaxy looks like when it is being used for the purpose it was shaped toward, all those millions of years ago, by beings who built a weapon and then vanished and left it running. Yet they are not finished, they are not tired, they are not losing, they are getting started. And that, sitting in the quiet and letting the weight of it settle, is why the green tide is the most terrifying thing in a setting built on nightmares. Because it is not chaos, it is not entropy. It is not the random cruelty of a universe that does not care. It is purpose, 60 million years old, designed by gods, and still fully functional. Sleep well. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, going all the way down into the deep roots of the green tide. The orcs are one of my favorite subjects in all of 40K lore, precisely because the more you dig into them, the more extraordinary and unsettling and genuinely fascinating they become. If this gave you something new to think about, if there was a piece of the lore that surprised you or changed how you see the greenskins, I genuinely want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you already knew. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me which clan you would follow if you had to choose one. Tell me what you want to explore next. If you are not subscribed yet, please consider doing that now. More content is coming, more quiet explorations of the darkest and most fascinating corners of this universe. I will see you in the dark. Script 4, Q40K, Warhammer 40K ASMR lore channel's topic, the Orks, the most terrifying warriors in Warhammer 40,000. Optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Appendix 1, The Anatomy of a Great Crusade, How Green Fire Spreads. It is worth spending some time on the mechanics of how an orc crusade actually grows. And because the process itself is one of the most fascinating things in the lore, a self-organizing system of almost biological elegance that takes a single point of charismatic violence and expands it into something capable of threatening star systems. It begins with a fight. It always begins with a fight. An orc of unusual size and capability, somewhere in the galaxy, wins a fight it was not expected to win. Maybe it defeats a local rival who had been considered unbeatable. Maybe it leads a warband raid against an Imperial outpost that destroys a target everyone assumed was beyond their reach. The victory matters less in itself than in the effect it has on the gestalt field. A victory perceived as extraordinary concentrates the attention of the surrounding orc population. The gestalt field, which responds to collective orc belief as much as collective orc presence, begins to subtly reinforce the winner. The orc who won starts getting slightly more energy from the field. It grows a little faster. It fights a little better in its next engagement. Word spreads in the way that words always spread in orc society, not through formal communication, but through the organic transmission of stories, carried by Gretchen running errands, by orcs who were present and are now visiting other warbands, by the vague but persistent sense that something is happening over there and it sounds interesting. An orc hearing about a war boss who fights well feels the pull of that. The call is partly rational, in the sense that following a strong war boss is a good survival strategy, but it is partly something deeper than rational. It is the pull of the gestalt field itself, responding to a concentration of green potential and drawing more green toward it. The warband grows. More orcs mean more gestalt energy. More gestalt energy means the war boss grows faster and fights better. The war boss fighting better means more victories. More victories mean more orcs arriving. The cycle is self-reinforcing from the beginning, and the question is only whether it will reach escape velocity or whether the war boss will die in battle before the momentum becomes self-sustaining. This is the critical phase. A crusade below a certain threshold of size and momentum is still fragile. The death of the war boss, a significant defeat that reduces the warband's numbers dramatically, or simply the arrival of a rival war boss with a compelling alternative can all break the momentum. While many potential crusades end here, in this early fragile phase, and their would-be leaders become a name in a casualty report and nothing more, but a crusade that survives this phase and crosses into self-sustaining growth changes nature. The gestalt field is now producing effects that make the crusade's existence its own best advertisement. Local orcs who join do not just make the crusade slightly bigger, they participate in a system that makes every member of the system more capable. The vehicles work better, the weapons hit harder, the orcs themselves begin growing at rates they would never have achieved in smaller warbands. There is a tangible, physical benefit to being part of this specific crusade that did not exist before the threshold was crossed, and every orc can feel it in the way that all orcs feel the gestalt. Not consciously, not as a thought, but as a rightness. A sense that this is where the best fighting is, and that the best fighting is where they should be. At this stage, the crusade begins attracting orcs from distances that become harder to explain through normal channels of information transmission. Warbands on the other side of a sector, who have had no direct contact with the crusade and have received no communication about it, begin moving in its direction anyway. The gestalt field of a sufficiently large and unified crusade has a psychic range that exceeds normal communication. It is a beacon in the warp, not in the dangerous sense that a human psyker's connection creates, but in the subtler sense of a signal that orc biology was designed to dissect and respond to. Something is happening, something big, something green. Come, a full-scale crusade is one that has crossed into genuine galactic significance, operates on a logic that is barely distinguishable from a natural disaster. You do not stop a hurricane by killing its center. You do not stop a crusade of this magnitude by killing its war boss, though killing the war boss does complicate the succession and might cause a temporary fragmentation. The conditions that created the crusade are still present. The momentum is still there. The gestalt field is still operating at its accumulated intensity. Another war boss rises. The crusade continues. And the new war boss, inheriting the full force of everything that was built before it, grows into its role with a speed that reflects the extraordinary conditions it has been dropped into. The only way to stop a crusade of this magnitude is to destroy it comprehensively. To kill so many orcs so quickly that the gestalt field drops below the threshold for self-sustaining operation, and the survivors, no longer bathed in the field's reinforcement, lose the cohesion that field was providing. This is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. It requires the ability to project overwhelming force against an enemy that grows in response to being fought. in quantities that the Imperium has only managed in specific historical circumstances against specific crusades. And even then, the spores remain. The spores always remain. Consider what this means over the long arc of history. A crusade that rises and is eventually stopped leaves behind, in every world it touched, in every asteroid field where its ships burned and crashed, in every trench and bunker and ruined city street where orcs fought and died. A biological archive, microscopic, patient, waiting. The next time conditions are right on any one of those worlds, a new orc population emerges. Not as organized as the crusade was, not immediately, but orcs growing, fighting among themselves, and eventually producing another war boss who wins one too many fights, and the attention of the surrounding greenskins begins to concentrate, and the gestalt field begins to build, and the cycle starts again. The orcs are not an invasion, they are a tide, and tides do not end. Appendix 2. Orcs in the Age of the Great Rift. The galaxy cracks open. The opening of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium changed the galaxy for every faction in ways that are still being calculated. A tear through the warp running most of the length of the galaxy, splitting the Imperium in two, and drowning thousands of worlds in warp storms, generating chaos incursions on a scale that had not been seen since the Horus Heresy. For most factions, the rift is catastrophe. For the orcs, the rift is closer to a stimulus. Consider what the Great Rift actually provides from an orc perspective. The collapse of stable warp routes has made travel and communication harder for the Imperium and for most other organized civilizations. This has reduced the Imperium's ability to coordinate rapid responses to threats, to send reinforcements before a situation becomes critical, to maintain the logistical chains that the Imperial war machine depends on. The orcs do not have logistical chains in the same sense. They do not require stable warp routes to maintain cohesion because their cohesion is biological and psychic rather than organizational. Yet the conditions that devastate Imperial military response capabilities do not devastate the conditions that allow orc crusades to function. The chaos incursions that the Rift generates provide exactly the kind of sustained high-intensity conflict that the orc genome responds to. Where chaos and Imperial forces meet, there is war. Where there is war, there are opportunities for orcs to join and grow. The fragmentation of the Imperium into multiple zones of varying stability has created dozens of local situations that previously would have received rapid Imperial response, but now receive delayed or degraded response. These situations last longer. They provide more sustained combat pressure for any orc warband in the vicinity. Yet the psychic disturbance generated by the Rift also interacts with the Gestalt field in ways that are still being studied by what remains of the Ordo Xenos research apparatus. The boundaries between the warp and the material world are thinner throughout the galaxy. The Gestalt field, which is itself a psychic phenomenon despite not interfacing with the warp, in the conventional sense, operates in an environment where the psychic substrate of the universe is more active and more responsive than it was before the Rift. Some weird boys have reported that their abilities have intensified since the opening of the Rift, that the ambient energy available to them has increased in ways that their biology was not fully designed to manage. Head explosions have, anecdotally, become somewhat more common. Ghazghkull Thraka's activities in this period are documented only patchily, given the intelligence difficulties the Imperium now faces, but the available evidence suggests a crusade that has not only continued through the chaos of the Rift's opening, but accelerated in response to it. The conditions that were already producing growth in his forces and in Ghazghkull himself have intensified. The galaxy has become, from the perspective of an orc warlord with 60-million-year-old genetic programming responding to sustained large-scale conflict, a better and better place to be. The Primarch Roboot Guilliman returned from his 10,000-year suspension in the stasis field to lead the Imperium through the crisis of the Rift's opening. It has assessed the orc threat in this period with the clarity of a strategic mind that was designed to understand these things. His assessments are not reassuring. The Indomitus crusade that he led across the galaxy in the years following his return encountered orc crusades of significant scale at multiple points along its path. Each encounter confirmed what the lore had been suggesting. The orcs of the late 41st and early 42nd millennium are not the same as the orcs of previous centuries. They are bigger, they are more organized, they are more technically capable. The gestalt field in territories with significant orc presence is measurably more intense than comparable measurements from earlier periods. The galaxy is getting greener. This is not a metaphor. It is an observation backed by the kind of evidence that 1,000 years of Ordo-Xenos field research produces when you look at it all together and acknowledge what it is telling you. Appendix 3. What the Orks mean. The wider view. There is a perspective on the Orks that emerges when you step back far enough from the immediate terror of the green tide and look at the 60-million-year arc. It is a perspective that the Orks themselves are incapable of holding because it requires the kind of reflective self-awareness that the Ork mind was not designed for. But it is worth articulating because it changes the way the Orks fit into the larger story of the galaxy. The Old Ones created the Krork as a solution to a problem. The problem was the Necrontyr and the Cetan, in a civilizational threat that the Old Ones could not handle with the tools they already had. The solution worked, insofar as the war in heaven ended without the Cetan achieving their stated goal of consuming all biological life in the galaxy. The Necrons went to sleep. The Cetan were shattered. The galaxy survived to produce the civilizations that now occupy it. In that narrow sense, the Krork were a success, but the Old Ones underestimated one thing: the durability of what they made. Or perhaps they knew exactly how durable it was and accepted the consequences as preferable to the alternative of losing the war in heaven. We cannot know because the Old Ones are gone and have not left accessible records of their reasoning. What we can observe is the result. A weapon so robustly designed that 60 million years after the war, it was built for ended. It is still running, still growing, still producing the conditions it was designed to produce. The galaxy the Old Ones seeded with life is now a place defined largely by what the Old Ones' most successful creation has done to it. The Orks have fought against every species that now exists in the galaxy. They have fought the Aeldari, the descendant species of the Old Ones' greatest psychic creation. They have fought the Necrons, who woke from their sleep to find the galaxy occupied by organic life, and specifically by enormous amounts of very angry green organic life. They have fought humanity, the newcomer species that had the audacity to develop galactic civilization in the millions of years the Necrons spent sleeping. They have fought the Tau, the Tyranids, each other, and anything else they could find. They have not won the galaxy, but they have never been eliminated from it. Every attempt to end the Ork threat permanently has produced a temporary setback followed by a restoration, because the species was designed by beings who understood that the most reliable weapon is one that repairs itself. The galaxy has been trying to solve the Ork problem for 60 million years. The problem remains. The galaxy has changed repeatedly in ways both catastrophic and profound. The Orks have changed barely at all. What was designed is what persists. There is something almost humbling about this. If humility is a concept that applies to examining the 40,000 setting, the Imperium of Man considers itself the pinnacle of human civilization, 10,000 years of sacrifice and struggle, and the maintenance of something that should by all rights have collapsed long ago. And in that 10,000 years, the Orks have been there. Before the Imperium existed, the Orks were there. After the Imperium ends, if it ends, the Orks will still be there, fighting, growing, looking for the next worthy engagement. The green tide is not a chapter in the galaxy's story. It is the water the chapter is written in. The philosophical tradition of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the imperial faith, teaches that the emperor of mankind is a cosmic force of order and enlightenment, preserving humanity against the darkness. It does not have a satisfying framework for the Orks, because the Orks are not darkness in the sense that chaos is darkness. They are not absence of meaning or corruption of meaning. They are a very pure and simple kind of meaning, the meaning of things built for a purpose continuing to fulfill that purpose. The Old Ones made something to fight, and it fights. It will always fight. The fighting is not going to stop. Understanding this does not make the Orks less terrifying. If anything, it makes them more so, because it removes the comfort of the narrative where the threat can eventually be eliminated if enough effort is applied. The Orks cannot be applied against. They can be redirected briefly. They can be managed locally at great cost. They cannot be solved because they are not a problem. They are a feature of the galaxy's design. So one of the most durable features, one of the features that, in certain lights, at certain moments of honesty about what the 41st millennium actually is, looks less like a problem to be overcome and more like the shape of everything. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And at the center of all that war, older than every empire and every god and every prophecy of end or salvation, the green tide rolls on, as it always has, as it was always going to, as it will, long after the last parchment recording this history has crumbled to dust and the last scholar who might have read it is gone. The Orks were here before us. They will be here after us. And somewhere in the warp, Krork and Mork are still fighting, and every battle ever fought in the material universe is a reflection of that eternal, cosmic, and absolutely pointless and completely perfect clash between the two greatest Orks there ever were. Sleep well, if you can. Appendix 4, the enemy they were made for, and what happens if they find it again. There is one question about the Orks that the lore raises but does not fully answer, one that sits at the intersection of biology and theology and the particular kind of cosmic dread that Warhammer 40,000 specializes in generating. The question is this: what happens if the Orks find an enemy worthy of the Krork? Not an enemy worthy of modern Orks, whose scale of threat is genuinely catastrophic already. An enemy worthy of what the Orks are capable of becoming if the right conditions are sustained long enough. The Necrons are waking up across the galaxy. Their tomb worlds, dormant for 60 million years, are coming back online as the dynasties shake off the dust of their long sleep and begin the process of reclaiming their empire. They are finding a galaxy that has moved on without them. Organic life has expanded to fill every corner of the galaxy in their absence. The Ceton they once served have been shattered and contained. The old ones who were their enemies are gone. The Necrons are, in a very real sense, returning to a universe that belongs to everyone else now. The Orks remember the Necrons, not consciously, not in the way that a civilization remembers through records and histories. They remember the way muscle remembers, the way a reflex recalls a threat before conscious thought can intervene. When Ork forces and Necron forces encounter each other, the Ork response is immediate and total, in a way that even the most extreme Ork aggression against other enemies does not quite capture. The Necrons, in turn, recognize the Orks in ways that their own records, preserved through 60 million years of stasis, document explicitly. They know what the Orks are. They know what the Orks were. And the most strategically sophisticated Necron lords understand that the modern Ork is not the Krork of the war in heaven, and that this is the only reason the encounter is survivable. The Tyranids present a different calculus. The hive mind is the largest and most alien intelligence in the galaxy, a collective consciousness spanning multiple galaxies that has been traveling toward the Milky Way for longer than humanity has existed. Its encounter with the Orks and Octarius demonstrated that sustained conflict against the green tide is not a good outcome for either party, and possibly a catastrophic one for the broader galaxy. But the hive mind adapts. The hive mind learns. And what the hive mind has learned from Octarius is information about Ork biology, Ork psychology, and Ork combat capability that no other intelligence in the galaxy possesses in the same systematic and applicable form. There is a theoretical scenario that some Ordo-Xenos analysts have documented under various levels of classification. A scenario where the conditions of the late 41st and early 42nd millennium produce the full expression of what the Ork genome was designed to create. A warlord of Krork scale, yet commanding forces whose individual members have all grown significantly beyond baseline modern Ork capability, sustained by a gestalt field of ancient intensity, directed by strategic intelligence comparable to what the Krork demonstrated in the war in heaven. This is what Ghazghkull is trending toward. This is what the beast was a preview of in the 32nd millennium. This is what the old ones built. If this emerges, the question becomes what it would fight. Because the thing the old ones built was built to fight the Cetan, whose fragments are scattered across the galaxy, and the Necrons, who are waking up in numbers that their stasis records suggest will eventually fill systems and sectors with cold metal legions. A conflict between a fully realized Neo-Krork empire and the Necron dynasties at full strength would be, by any calculation, the largest military engagement since the war in heaven itself. Both sides have the numbers for it. Both sides have the genetic or mechanical memory of fighting each other. Both sides have the capability to sustain a conflict of that scale. The rest of the galaxy would be the collateral damage of a rematch 60 million years in the making. This is speculation, clearly. The lore does not confirm it. It does not deny it either. What it does is build, with extraordinary consistency across decades of creative development, a picture of a species that is trending in a specific direction, whose biology was designed to reach a specific endpoint under specific conditions, and whose current circumstances look increasingly like those specific conditions. The arrow is pointing somewhere. The direction is clear. The destination is not confirmed. But it is suggested by everything the arrow has been pointing at since the Old Ones first put it in motion. The Orks are not done becoming what they are going to become. They are in the process of becoming it. And the galaxy, which has been enduring the Orks at their diminished modern capability for tens of thousands of years at least, does not appear to be prepared for what comes next. This is the final reason the Orks occupy a unique place among the terrors of the 40K setting. Every other threat is what it already is. The Chaos Gods are the Chaos Gods. The Tyranids are the Tyranids, vast and hungry and ancient in their own way. The Necrons are the Necrons, awakening to find a galaxy that fears them for what they already are. But the Orks are not what they are going to be. They are getting there, slowly by cosmic standards. Rapidly by any other standard, trending towards something that the galaxy has not seen since before humanity existed as a species. And the galaxy, in all its grim darkness, does not have a contingency plan for that arrival. The weapon is coming home to its original purpose. The Old Ones who built it are gone. The enemies they built it to fight are waking up. And in between, every civilization and every empire and every desperate last stand will just have to endure the green tide until history decides what the green tide was actually building toward. That is the story of the Orks. That is why they matter. That is why, at the end of all the analysis and the history and the theological framework and the biology, the answer to why the Orks are the most terrifying thing in the galaxy is simple. They are not finished yet. Yet thank you so much for spending this time with me, going all the way down to the deepest roots of the green tide. The Orks are one of my favorite subjects in all of 40K lore, precisely because the more you dig into them, the more extraordinary and unsettling and genuinely wonderful they become. If this gave you something new to think about, if there was a piece of the lore that surprised you or changed how you see the greenskins, I genuinely want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you already knew. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me which clan you would follow if you had to choose one. Tell me what corner of the lore you want to go into next. If you are not subscribed yet, please do that now. More is coming. More quiet explorations of the darkest and most fascinating corners of this universe. Wait, I will see you in the dark. Script for Q40K, Warhammer 40K, SMR lore. Channel topic, the Orks. The most terrifying warriors in Warhammer 40,000 optimized for 11 labs, voiceover generation, bonus section, the sound of the green tide. An Ork warband up close. We have spent this entire exploration in the elevated register, historical, biological, theological, strategic. But there is value in descending from that height for a moment and considering what encountering the Orks is actually like, not as a series of facts, but as an experience. What a soldier on the ground, defending a wall or a trench or a ruined building, actually faces when the Orks come. It starts with the sound. Long before you can see them, before any visual confirmation of what is heading toward your position, you hear them. Yet the noise travels ahead of the physical mass, the way a ship's bow wave travels ahead of the hull. It is not like artillery, which arrives in discrete events with identifiable gaps. It is continuous. It builds from a distant rumble, something you might initially dismiss as atmospheric disturbance or manufacturing noise from some other part of the front. Then it becomes clearly biological, clearly the sound of many large bodies in motion, clearly the sound of voices, but too many voices to count, and each one too large for comfort. Then it becomes something else, something that experienced soldiers describe not as sound, but as pressure, a vibration in the bones and the chest that precedes the cognitive recognition of what it is. By the time your brain has processed that this is the start of an Ork assault, the sound is already overwhelming everything else. The engines of their vehicles, each one making the kind of noise that well-maintained machinery does not make, but that functions somehow, despite that noise. The weapons being discharged, not in coordinated volleys, but in a continuous, irregular roar of orc gunnery that lays down more raw fire than any military doctrine accounts for in a frontal assault. The voices, individual now when they were a uniform wall before, each one clearly articulating something you probably do not want to understand, even if you could parse it over the noise. The smell arrives with the sound. Orc biology produces a characteristic odor that soldiers who have fought at them describe with unusual consistency, something green and organic and fundamentally alive. Get cut through with the sharp chemical bite of their improvised explosives, the oil and metal smell of their vehicles, and something underneath all of it that is harder to name but easier to feel. The physical presence of the gestalt field, expressed as an atmospheric quality, a thickness in the air, a sense of being in proximity to a phenomenon that does not acknowledge your perception of it, but is entirely indifferent to your survival. Then you see them. The first visual impression is always the sheer scale, not just the individual orcs, though the individual orcs are large enough to register as alarming on their own. The scale of the numbers. A wall of green that stretches across the horizon, not in the organized geometric formations of human military doctrine, but in the organic shoving, is somehow fast despite the chaos way that orc assault formations move. They are not marching, they are not advancing in any disciplined sense. They are flooding forward the way water floods forward, finding every gap, filling every space, going wherever the path leads with the remorseless momentum of a thing that has no instinct for stopping. The war boss, if one is present in this portion of the assault, is visible. You cannot miss it. At 3 meters or more, it is simply a different scale of creature than everything around it, and it is moving with the kind of directed purpose that distinguishes a thinking entity from a biological wave. The war boss is not swept forward by the advance. It is leading it, and the difference between those two things is legible even through the chaos of a full assault. It knows where it is going. It has decided to go there, and the gap between its current position and wherever it has decided to be is closing at a rate that your calculations about defensive line sustainability now need to account for. The veterans of Armageddon describe a specific experience that occurs when you have survived multiple orc engagements and developed the pattern recognition that survival requires. You begin to read the assault the way a sailor reads a weather system. The places where the density is highest indicate where the momentum is greatest. The places where the vehicles concentrate indicate priority objectives. The individual orcs who are moving against the flow of the general advance, the ones heading towards specific structures rather than simply forward, are likely commandos or blood axe specialists with a specific target in mind. The war boss's movement direction predicts the assault's eventual focus, because the war boss is going where it decided the best fight is, and the rest of the assault will follow. None of this analysis helps very much with the actual problem, which is that there are a very large number of orcs, and they are getting closer every second. But the analysis gives you something to focus on other than the sound, which by this point is no longer a sound so much as a state of being that exists in your bones and your chest cavity and the part of your brain that was not designed for philosophical reflection. The first rank hits the fortified position. This is the moment where all the theory and all the history and all the strategic analysis collapses into the immediate, specific, its completely present experience of a very large creature trying to come through whatever is between it and you. Orc combat at close range is everything the biology suggests it would be: powerful, fast, in a way that the size should not permit, capable of absorbing damage that removes combatants from the fight in amounts that should have stopped them long before this point. The regenerative biology means that orcs who should be incapacitated by wound thresholds that stop other combatants are still fighting. The distributed internal architecture means that targeted shots that would be immediately fatal to other species are absorbed and compensated for, and through it all, the noise never stops. The voices are individual now, specific, directed at you and at each other and at everything in general. The orc does not fight in silence. The orc annotates combat with continuous commentary that ranges from what sounds like tactical direction to what sounds like genuine enthusiasm for the experience to what sounds, in the quiet moments between the louder sounds, like something that is simply glad to be here. That last thing is the strangest part. Every soldier who has survived prolonged engagement with orc forces eventually mentions it. The orcs are having a good time. Not in the way that a psychologically conditioned soldier learns to function in combat and derives some satisfaction from skill and survival. in the way that a creature doing exactly what it was built to do experiences the complete alignment of capability and purpose. The Orks are not suffering through this. They are not enduring it. They are in their element, entirely, without reservation or internal conflict, doing the thing that 60 million years of design produced them to do. It is, in the middle of all the danger and the noise and the smell and the desperate calculations about ammunition and defensive line integrity and medevac timing, the most disorienting thing about the whole experience. They love this, and that, in the end, is what every soldier who fights them has to somehow process and file away in a corner of their mind that they do not open very often. Because opening it and thinking too long about what it means brings you back to the same conclusion that all the strategic analysis brings you to. You can fight these things. You can defeat them in this engagement, on this wall, today. You can hold this line and claim this victory and survive this particular tide. But the tide does not stop. It does not get tired. It does not reassess its strategic position and decide the costs outweigh the benefits. It comes back. It comes back larger than it was before, because the fighting made it larger, because that is what the fighting is for, because that is what the old ones designed it to do 60 million years ago, and the design is still working exactly as intended. The sound is already starting again, somewhere in the distance. It is always starting again, somewhere. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, going all the way down to the very roots of the green tide. From the war in heaven 60 million years ago, through the biology that makes an orc nearly impossible to kill permanently, through the theology of Gork and Mork, is through the beast and Ghazghkull and Octarius and the cracks opening in the sky above our heads right now in the 42nd millennium. The Orks are one of my favorite subjects in all of 40K lore, precisely because the more you dig into them, the more extraordinary and unsettling and genuinely fascinating they become. If this gave you something new to think about, if there was a moment that reframed how you see the greenskins, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what you already knew. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me which clan you would run with if you had to choose one. Tell me what you want to explore next, because this channel goes wherever the dark parts of the lore are deepest and most interesting. And your comments are the compass. If you are not subscribed yet, please do that now. More content is coming. In more quiet explorations of the darkest and most fascinating corners of this universe. The next one is already taking shape, and I think you are going to find it worth the wait. I will see you in the dark.